Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m., Tuesday, the 22nd of October, and you are watching episode 148 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Separation. Can everyone be winners? Is my guest Dan Petrie, journalist and data analyst. Dan is a journalist and financial professional specialising in statistics, having served as a data editor at Bloomberg's and News Corporation. He has a deep understanding of global markets, economic and commodities, honed through decades of reporting and analysis. Dan's work has shaped industry insights and direction, particularly in mining, resources and economic trends. He currently heads up data initiatives for mining.com.au and is the founder of charteconomics.com and is a subject matter expert and contributor for Google News Academy. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for that introduction.
Well, you wrote it.
I impressed myself.
Look, I really like to thank you for coming on. I mean, I got to contact you after I watched the Damien Corey interview, and I watched it right through to the end. And then you dropped a little bombshell in regards to North Queensland separation and separate states. So I thought I'd get you on for that because that's one of our bents, if you could say.
Yeah.
But we're coming up to the eve of the state election, and it's quite fortuitous because I came across an article that you did along with Marcus Smith for the IPA leading up to the 2020 election. And I just thought we'd just go through it a little bit to start with and to see what's different in 4 years because it seems to be the same topics. But I'll just throw it up on the screen and we'll just flick through it fairly quickly.
Sure.
It's up on the screen now, and it was an article, still the Sunshine State, but like this time every year, the story usually goes on about daylight saving and the fact that some people want it and other people don't. But this was leading into the 2020 election, and we're just going basically into the start. Well, this was the end of this is October 2020, so we'd been in the COVID for nearly a year, and the government had kept us safe. So it was quite a different sort of election. I think it was sort of the result was culled a bit from the happenings of COVID. But just going through it, I mean, here's a header: debt, bloated public service, and crime dominate the issues before the Queensland voter.
Yeah.
Do you think they're sort of still in focus now?
I think Marcus, who co-wrote the article and the column with me, I mean, he had a very good, and he still does, he's one of the best in the business when it comes to, profiling debt. And, the Queensland debt situation, it's always there vagaries associated because they tend to load up the power companies, the energy companies, and with debt because they're predictable revenue earners, and you can therefore have high levels of debt. But Queensland's headline debt, when you bring it all together, that's what the ratings agencies look at. That's still very much in focus, I think. But in saying that, it doesn't have the same kind of hoodoo, boogeyman factor, certainly electorate, as it once did. People are kind of used to the idea of governments owing debt. And there's been a few academics that have come out saying that debt's not a problem, and that's a steep one. But anyway, that was quite popular only 2 years ago. But in the case of crime, well, it certainly remains problematic. You've now lost a generation, in the last 10 years. I mean, the crime offences data, which was released by QPS, is also, reveals that just in raw hard numbers. You often see, I'd say the centre-left parties like to use proportion of head, but it's a terrible way of measuring crime. A victim is a victim. If there's lots more of them, it's certainly a problem. And I think Queensland's they've clearly failed on that policy objective. You'd have to say, like even their own data borne out by QPS would reveal that. And in terms of a bloated public service. I think that's actually the systemic. I think it's a big problem. I think it's probably the biggest problem that we confront in federation is this idea of three major population centres clustered along the east coast in, southeast Queensland. So I'm talking Sunshine, Gold Coast, and Brisbane and Queensland. Central Coast, New South Wales, Sydney, down to Wollongong, and then of course you've got Geelong and Melbourne. Australia has got so many advantages. One is land. Two is you've got fertile land in large parts, and three is but the problem is the industry of government is clustered around these three centres. And so, I've said more recently that, like people the idea of a seventh state or the idea of more states, which I'm just I'm an abolitionist of the current federation. I think it simply does not work. And I mean, the principle of subsidiarity should really be what's applied here. That's what the Catholic Church, it's quite strange to write about it, but that's what they would promote, that you get the greatest effect you have is at local level. And then my old boss, Mike Bloomberg, would say the same thing. So to come back to your question, the three themes haven't changed. And I think if anything, I'm not sure if Marcus has done the numbers recently, but I think he'd be horrified. But yeah, that's one of those things.
But I suppose the thing is with debt now that people don't worry about it as much as it used to be a big boogie, and the public don't seem to worry about it because it's something that's being put off to future generations. So, that's probably one of the big problems. We're just handing this debt down to the next generation. The other thing with crime, I'm not sure in regards to if statistics, they can be cherry picked, but the other thing that they can be corrupted by maybe directions or that say, well, let's not charge everyone with the crimes that they commit. Just give them warnings so it starts to corrupt the numbers. And then with the public service, that's bloated, and we know that from just the direct hirings of the Queensland government in particular. But we've got a new phenomenon now where there's so many pseudo public servants. I mean, everyone who works in the childcare industry is effectively employed by the taxpayer in some way. They're dependent on the government giving these providers lots of money so they're being employed. Then you've got governments who come up with this criteria that they've got to have a certificate or something. I mean, my wife raised 3 kids. She didn't have a certificate in childcare or anything like that, and nor as previous generations. But now it's a sort of mandatory thing. Plus, things like blue cards, so that all adds up to it. And then now you've got the NDS, where there's so many people now in that service industry that are completely dependent on NDIS funds going to these providers so they get a job and do things like, just take people who are disabled and that to the movies or some other thing, So we now have a real different system in regards to actually who's on the government's payroll anymore. And it seems to me that we're getting less and less people who are actually in the productive area and wealth creation area that are making the money for the country to keep our dollar afloat type thing. And then the people who are actually creating wealth so the government can hand it out further along the line. Do you see us getting into a situation, and especially now that you've gone to mining.com.au and getting a real perspective of what's going on in the resources industry, that how precarious our situation is if we don't sort of watch those industries and foster those industries that actually create new capital and wealth?
Well, the resources sector is a fantastic case in point, isn't it? I mean, plenty of jobs there. It's a high risk industry too. I mean, like a large number of the businesses on the ASX, for example, are junior explorers. And if the regulatory framework is poor or there's a risk to it, and the sovereign risk, which we've seen with the coke and coal instances in Queensland, it's basically, if you want to put it really, distill it down, you spoke about, the childcare, the subsidies there. At the federal level, it's also aged care. You get a subsidy. Those providers are incentivized by the federal government tax lurk. So you have ASX listed companies, depending on government policy in terms of the way of being funded for profitability. It's quite scary. So the self-reliant part is certainly now that intertwined government spend. It's elevated and it's now fueled by debt. So that ability, for example, self-determination is certainly becoming a thing of the past. To come back to the area of resources, truthfully, it's the only game in town in terms of an industry capable of generating export revenues that can shower federal budgets through company tax and some of their PART and mineral rent resources taxes, and at the state level, the royalties with a quantum which is large enough to fund, spending promises, which, you'd have to say, I'd say that I've worked across many industries, but school lunches and all sorts of, like 50-cent bus fares, they might be populist, but they're reckless. Truth.
But the other thing is too, you would think governments would be nurturing and sort of making sure those money earners kept on getting stronger and stronger and bigger, and so the revenue would keep flowing on. But the regulations don't seem to speak that. And I mean, all right, you've got iron ore and you've got coal, and then the other minerals are pretty, well down below those two big items. And then you've got agriculture. But every bit of legislation that's coming out from either government, state or federal, seems to handicap or basically kneecap some industries and that, like in regards to our agricultural industry, we don't seem to be wanting to help farmers in regard to land management. We just want to hobble them with more regulation. Then we don't want to make water available to them that readily. We don't want to bring any new water or irrigation projects on stream. And then when it comes to mining, you make sure that they have to jump through every environmental hurdle that you can possibly come up with. And then when they think they're over the finish line, you throw another one in their way, like we saw with Regis and the gold mine down in near Bathurst, New South Wales. So how do we or how does the industry start getting together in regards to at least trying to make the government, be aware of what the precarious situation not only putting the industries in, but the country itself?
Well, the industry associations, which are supposed to represent business, sadly, don't. They're more interested in acquiescing to the government of the day. In Queensland, for example, and I know this because I used to churn out the lines for the Chamber of Commerce, you have to whistle the government tune. And as a result of that, you can't advocate. And what your members might want or what you passionately believe in is constantly a case of acquiescence. And so we saw that, for example, in that absurd, and it really was absurd, where the Business Council of Australia joined with the unions and the trade and the Trojan horse of patent bargaining to reintroduce that. I thought that was an incredibly naive and stupid thing to do. And I think I wrote about it at the time, and Jennifer Westacott, I was one of the writers. They said, "How dare you?" But the broader point about the Regis gold mine in New South Wales was inexplicably a strange decision, and again, it only invites questions as to whether Australia is a reasonable place to invest. And then the productive capacity, that is, you're quite right. In Queensland, for example, there's no major coal projects in the pipeline. There are some, but they're very small. And that might be great for people who live in metropolitan cities, but where's the revenue going to come from? You either start having to kind of increase the GST, but then you get a situation where if you don't have the industry, the export earning, you have to basically boost your levels of consumption tax, and that's the GST. And of course, that's its own inflationary, blip, if you like. Australia, I think personally, has a gigantic challenge ahead in terms of the business community has failed in terms of being able to champion the case, and they've, I think for a large part become preoccupied with what I would call, more social issues, things which, kind of resonate in social media. But the stuff which makes the money, which pays the taxes, Australia's corporate tax rate, I'd be forgiven for the numbers, for example, even at 27%, not very competitive. High income tax rate, not very competitive. You got problems, and then you got the very low consumption rate and a lack of willingness to address it. It's not a pro-business mentality. And the country, like everyone wants to be in the startups and all that, but why would you do it in Australia? It's very, very difficult. I mean, you have this R&D tax grants, which are more or less an R&D tax fraud. They're basically, the taxpayer is funding failed businesses to stay alive. And so when you, I'm probably extending your question, but we've got a very serious situation when the natural industrial money-making advantages we have are in ag and in resources. People can talk about education and as being an export industry, but very subjective how you measure it. But they're the big two. But most of the population lives around Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and they're preoccupied with issues because they don't know, they're not aware. I mean, if you've got guaranteed tenure in your job, then of course you can opine on all sorts of quite, trendy issues. But the reality is those jobs are at the end of the day funded by resources, the agriculture, gas, and whether people like it or not, especially, and I'll name the Greens as whether they like it or not, that is the only thing I would say we really have going for us. And people can tell me about medical science advancements. We're a piddle next to what's going on in the United States.
Just touching on, you're talking about, the peak body sort of, capitulating with the new government early on in the piece and that. But do you think it's more of big companies where all the people who are employed in those big companies are living off the shareholders' profits type thing, and not real business people that are taking the risk? Because I had a look at Matt Barry and Freelance.
Yeah. Mm.
And I heard an interview with him, and he wasn't half giving it to everyone in regards to not using our coal and our energy and doing and making things. He laid it on, and I sort of went on the Freelancer website, and I didn't see any DEI there. As far as the people running it, do you think that the social construct of a lot of public companies where it's only shareholders' money anyway have been sort of, pushed over to this agenda, and they're forgetting their core job to deliver profits for the shareholder rather than sort of, we'll take advice from shareholders who want to make us do things that are green and all this, institutional shareholders other than the real shareholders.
In a short answer, I mean, the unpopular and the thing which makes you a maverick, and if you say you agree with the premise of your question, I think that's quite obvious at corporate Australia. I'm talking the top 20 here. They talk, like they're now accused of greenwashing, but to the points you raised in terms of shareholder funds, there is, I would say, certainly at the institutional level, that is true. This ESG is basically the, economic, social, governmental policy, and I think energy, societal, governmental policies, and that's become part of the big framework. If you don't apply to that, that's a terrible thing. But it does invite the question. I think the question you're saying, which is really, is this the focus of the business? I mean, you can't have, like a company, like if they're not focused on producing a return for the shareholder, private or public. It has to observe the crucible of costs and, maximizing revenues and making sure you do it for the leanest possible price. But we have inherited a culture, and I think in Australia has really come about in the last 20 years where the optics of, wanting to do these things and spending large amounts of shareholder capital in them has become more in vogue. And so, if you can produce a video with beautiful offices and lovely looking people, talking about your collective mission, there is certainly, I think, that invites that criticism, and there's no question about that. But I'm almost 50 now, and so the world's changed somewhat. When I was growing up in the 80s and I wanted to be a ruthless banker, those ruthless bankers aren't too ruthless anymore, and they're very concerned about, they used to want to eat polar bears, and now they're all about saving them. But I'm joking, of course, but that's certainly been a very interesting dynamic to see this kind of, softly, but I'd have to also say that the shareholder funds, are they going into innovating? That's the other question is, or are they going into activism? And the question is, do Australian corporate big business, does it innovate? And if it's a new looking website, I wouldn't call that innovation.
But the other thing is too, do you think also the amount of public money that's around for certain directions, for companies to take is a big attraction? I mean, I'm the president of a group looking to make a North Queensland state, and we've got a lot of supporters, but some of those people are in business and they chuck us a few bucks, some of it reasonably, welcome sort of thing.
Mm.
But they cannot venture out and sort of say, well, we support a North Queensland state or what, because the fact is they're going after the next contract for something
Yeah.
government, or there's a grant coming up. And do you think a lot of businesses have just got this, a mindset, or at least a division, that keeps looking at where they can get public money? People like Twiggy Forrest, I'm sure he did well with getting Fortescue off the ground
Mm.
and things like that. There was a lot of adversary there, but he seems to have gone on to well, I'll do something, but is there a government subsidy in it? And I mean, you've got Cannon Brooks and you've got all these high flyers and that.
Mm.
And has it now become part of business that they're focusing on that government or public monies as well?
Well, that's probably one of the dirty secrets. Exposing that, so to speak, or highlighting the tax advantage, or the direct funding. I mean, that a lot of these businesses get. In the media, for example, it's unknown that, but a lot, because of the need for local content, you often find the Australian government as the funder of last resort. Media companies, and so that's an example. But to your point, though, like those businesses that aren't prepared to kind of take positions which are not the norm, has become, like, I do think the business community in large part is now cowed by the idea of vehemently opposing government policy. I mean, I'd have to go to Jerry Harvey as the one person who speaks his mind. And even if it is kind of, it upsets, let's say, the more trendy, affluent types, it's quite refreshing because the rest of them don't. I mean, the idea, for example, that anybody, I mean, who, like, you look at the tax settings in Australia, they're ridiculous and they're out of whack. Even in the OECD, it's very high, as I said before, very high income tax rates, very low consumption tax rates. Right? Australia is an outlier, right? But the idea of raising the GST, no, can't have the debate. Where's business on this? Where's business on the IR debate? Where's business on, the taxation debate? Where's business on really, the federation debate? Now, the federation debate is an incredibly important one. Now, I know you're part of there's a couple of groups up there. There's called Seventh State and a few doing their things, but the area in question has quite poor numbers of actual representation. And so that ability to develop an economy north of Gympie, for example, is a missed opportunity for Australia. That is where the population is flowing to. Eventually it's getting there because it's being priced out of the southeast corner. Price signals will push you further north, and that's just a phenomenon all over the world. Sunbelt states tend to do that. So, coming back to the question, like businesses, hanging out for the public, that is now part of it. there's a LERC, there's a grant. I mean, if we were to be really honest in Australia, I mean, how much money have we spent on R&D grants? How much money have we spent on, direct to business grants? I mean, the environmental grants on creating net zero and all these things have come at a cost of billions. Have they actually achieved outcomes which would have been better off with cheaper loans that the banks wouldn't go for because of the risk associated?
And the thing is, they never look at the return. I mean, that seems to be a non-entity sort of thing. Um, so, but the other thing is looking at the budget of the federal government over the last probably less than 10 years. I seem to remember, I mean, their revenue was around about 225 billion dollars a year, and now it's up over 500 billion dollars, and I think approaching six. So now they've got a massive pool of money, and gee whiz, aren't they throwing it around here, there, and everywhere? So it is very attractive for people. Well, can we get a bite of that? But one of the things that doesn't seem to happen is the building of infrastructure. The government now gets this huge amount of revenue, and basically, let's face it, 90 to 95% of all government revenue is in the hands of the federal government. And then they dish a bit out here and there, but they don't seem to be doing too well on their core things. I mean, the federal government's supposed to be looking after defence and biosecurity, immigration and that, and I think they've dropped the ball in those sort of things and got involved in social engineering areas and stuff that the state should be looking at. Do you see a situation where they might be forced to stop throwing the money around and actually get some tangible assets behind it so that will earn some revenue?
Well, there's I think the taxation revenues around 650. I think the outgoings are at a similar mark. I think they get boosted by, resources windfalls. They tend to be underestimated, and then you invariably get the treasure of the day. It doesn't matter if it's Frydenberg or Chalmers, and they'll say this is due to our excellent economic management. It's absurd when government ministers, talk about how they've lowered the employment rate. It's absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, it's and how that they're good for interest rates. I mean, that's another. I remember John Howard said, interest rates will always be lower in the college. I mean, what a stupid thing to say, but obviously people bought into it. But that was a classic case in point. But I've lost the train of thought here. But just really, I think it's a question of debt. How does it stop? It's the ratings agencies. I mean, that's what happens is the moment you get a credit downgrade, that is what you need to spook the horses, so to speak. I can remember when I was at Bloomberg, I think it was around 2011 when Greece was going under. And it was actually a bank in Cyprus which had fallen over, where the Dow had dropped 5%. And then, the thing which was the irony of that whole situation was Greece said, no, we're not paying. And here's the weird thing. 18 months before that situation, their debt profile was it wasn't great, but it wasn't, for example, cause for concern. And then literally that it became cause for concern very quickly. It was quite the thing. I remember I went to the UK during this time. I think I was giving some sham talk on, Australia's golden economy, which really should have been. We've been blessed with the mining industry, which showers us with billions, but you can't say it like that. You have to go, well, it's our engineers and our brain power, and people are going, oh, tell us more, bald man with numbers. But the reality is that in the Greece case, sentiment was what started driving their problems, not so much fundamentals. And then the price of the risk profile of the bonds went up. At one point, it was like, a Greek bond was paying 27%, because of its high default rate. The European Central Bank came in and said, no, we're guaranteeing it. So those people that bought in at 20 made an absolute fortune, but they work in the inverse of the way markets work. So when people say, the global financial crisis, actually, in a lot of ways, it was a bond boom, so to speak, because you're picking up debt. And so that's what happened there, because people lowering their risk. But on the broader thematics. Australia's got it's got an unhealthy addiction to spending, that's for sure. It's got an unhealthy addiction to not innovating on how to cut costs, and that budget profile. I think if it's 650 is the expense line billion, I think the social. When I was doing the budget, I did about 8 of them, and the social kind of the welfare part of the budget was around a third, 34%. I think when you add in the health after that, it's about 65%. So those two portfolios alone are big mega majors, and they're not great at building infrastructure, despite all the rhetoric. That's what's all these boards. They're not particularly good at delivering it. I mean, the NBN's a case in point. So finally, and it's probably more a redirect to you, Bill. But the thing is, we're now living in an age where everyone hated Scott Morrison, couldn't wait to get rid of him, so we thought. But now who talks about the federal government? It used to be a case where it used to dominate the news, and now it's like kind of case, well, Albo's in town, he's just bought a house. It's
Well,
not real.
there doesn't seem to be much substance either in the government, and there's not much substance in the news either. I mean, you can trawl through all the major papers of Australia, and they're just a rinse and repeat of the same thing. There's no real detail on any story, and there's certainly no in-depth conversation about what's going on in other parts of the world. And I suppose for some people who get to the back page, towards the back page in the business areas, there might be something. But it's also concerning that there's a big difference in regards to the government's attitude towards different industries at the moment. I mean, I remember, I'm advocate for Project Iron Boomerang. I think it's got some good points, and there's a few issues with it at all. It can't get a Guernsey, but I remember probably about four years ago, there was a startup or supposed startup of a company called Murchison Hydrogen out of West Australia. I think Kalis was in on it. He was the guy, Fisher guy, who's in the lobster industry and all that. And basically, they only had a bit of a sketch on a napkin, you could say, but the government gave them major project status, on that basis. And I think eventually what happened is it sort of it wasn't advancing anywhere. I think they sold that over to Copenhagen investment sort of thing, and they're sort of running with it, but they've harvested plenty of taxpayer money. But yeah, it gets a Guernsey, but something solid that's talking about manufacturing, using our own resources to create something in Australia, can't seem to get a Guernsey. Do you think why is that? Why can't we? We've got more big people making lots of money in iron ore, and we've got big people in the coal industry. Yet we can't seem to get our stuff in one pile to make steel.
No, and look, that's a good point, isn't it? I mean, like I think it's Blue Steel. I got maybe a smelter. I think it was down in Wollongong, Port Kembla. It was South 32. I think one of those ones. But the a couple of points that are interesting, which that come from the question. What are the economic settings? Why would you want to set up a business in Australia? Like, I mean, the labour laws are onerous. That is an obvious. No one's asking, but the problem again with industrial relations, and I say this on a number of different things I appear on, is that these debates around workers are often conducted with the backdrop of grey skies and satanic mills, when the facts of the matter is Australia's got a prohibitively expensive and regulatory overreach in an environment. It's got 3 levels of government to deal with. So, for example, if let's say, Bill, you and I go to New Zealand to set up, I don't know, a frisbee factory, we're only dealing with 2 levels of government. I mean, I don't know who'd want to buy a frisbee from Bates and Petrie, but the broader point being is it's relatively straightforward to do. When I lived in Hong Kong, I could set up a business within a morning. In Australia, it is absolutely a mission. I have to go into a bank with a letter, an accountant has to do it, and then that ability, that frictionless way of getting on with the job is incredibly difficult. The litigious, the regulatory environment, like this ridiculous obsession with Australia being a startup hub. No one has the heart to tell the politicians. No one wants their startup to be headquartered in Australia. No one. And the truth of the matter is the pond's relatively small. It's not what our natural knitting is. Yes, it's important to have good people, good technologists. I'm a technologist. But the reality is that we need to develop industries which can foster meaningful jobs. Now, in terms of manufacturing, this is probably where I'm a contrarian. I mean, I don't think necessarily manufacturing jobs are more noble than service jobs, but the fact of the matter is, are we creating industries capable of standing on their own two feet, or do they rely on government largesse? And that's called the thematic we're talking about here. Increasingly, Australia, they rely on government largesse. And the other thing is, if they rely on government largesse, then in some ways you're effectively owned by government.
But a lot of that is because the government has set up regulations so anti-market that they sort of can't get around it. I mean, we've got an industrial relations system that in no way gives any worth to the employer and their actions and their efforts to provide jobs. The Industrial Relations Court is just focused on supposedly giving the workers more rights, more money, more better conditions and stuff like that, and doesn't think about productivity. This is a basic. Any pay rise without a productivity gain is simply inflation. So you might get a pay rise today, but you've just created this inflation that's going to eat that away fairly quickly, and you're going to be worse off come a year's time or whatever. Well, we don't seem to be able to get this balance right in regards to some respect for the people who are providing the jobs versus the people who are providing the labour. There seems to be no focus on the obligations of workers actually to provide the work that they're being paid for.
Well, and then I think that there's certainly truism to that. I mean, I think the best practice industry construction policy, I think that was BPIC. I think that was the where the CFMEU, if you read that report, that legislation, it was basically authored by the CFMEU, and the government made no attempt to disguise that. But then you have a problem where the bodies which should be screaming blue murder are more interested in the fact that today, we went to a helium display or whatever, that is the problem. And so the idea that in Australia, if you talk to your colleagues or my colleagues in America or in the UK, they are horrified when you tell them the construction costs of a stadium in Australia, because it just doesn't compute. This idea of that you can get paid like an allowance for arriving, and then you get paid a day full if it's raining. This is just madness, right? As opposed to that output. So there's no incentive. You often hear, like, when tradies say to me, might as well just hold up lollipop sign. When they're saying that, they're effectively saying they've given up, even if they're joking. But we don't, we've got a culture now of can't do. We've got a culture where, like you spoke before, why can't we get jobs going? Even if we were to get manufacturing jobs going, the good workers would actually end up working in the resources sector, because that's where the jobs are. So you get a problem there. And where are the rest of the workers? Well, they're working for the state, or they're working in roles which are not particularly meaningful. And as tough as that is to say, it's just a fact. We don't have really, if you look at there's 19 odd job categories, health's the biggest employer, but it's also the biggest part-time employer. So you have all these people working in roles which are, it's very hard to put value on it. And the value is so, bottom line, our industry settings are poor. And why would you set up a city? You need to be close to, a government agency. And in America, you've got 50 odd states. You can set up in Ohio. They've got competitive federalism there. They've got tax breaks. They've got an idea of going, we'll give you this and that. And whilst I have problems with some of that, I'd rather an outcome which is competitive which yields a great result. That's how innovation is arrived at. That's the law of the
Just cutting out there.
jungle.
But I think when our forefathers created the federation, there was an element of competitive federalism, and
Reflective of what
we're just breaking up a little bit. Yeah, so
just
and the federation, the constitution provide for the creation of extra states. It's just that it hasn't happened. So that's an issue. And I think the other thing that's happened is the Commonwealth has sort of entered into a lot of areas that it wasn't originally, supposed to look at. I mean, it doesn't need an education department. It doesn't need a health department like as such for general health. It runs no hospitals, it runs no schools, so it doesn't need probably about 8 or 10,000 public servants in Canberra that it has got. So yes, America's got the wood on us in regards to number of states, but gee whiz, we don't seem to be very keen to move away from the coast.
Well, no, but herein lies, I mean, South Australia, when it was set up, had maybe 40,000 people, and that's how that was good enough for statehood. Queensland had, I think 100-odd thousand people, and that was good enough for statehood. When there was a referendum in New England to become its own state, for some bizarre reason, the governor or the premier of the day included Newcastle into that mix, and that proved to be a bit of a, well, not just a filibuster, but a dam buster, because those water flows that became the story, and that the results of that referendum are fascinating because it didn't get up based on the no vote in Newcastle.
Well, the interesting thing there was when Charles Cutler, who was the leader of the Country Party, and his party was fairly well connected to the New England movement, coerced, I would say, was probably a good word, coerced Askin that if they won the 65 election, that they'd give New England a referendum. But the problem was they only won it by 2 seats. So they only had a 2-seat margin. Now, if separate state had got up, the first thing that would have happened, northeast Queen, New South Wales would have separated, taken with it probably anything up to 10 or 11 coalition seats, primary the then Country Party, and then the Liberals would have been back out in the wilderness for another 20 or 30 years in Sydney. So you could see the mindset there is why they hooked on to the 1933 Nichols Commission recommendation in regards to rivers and where you got your water from, so locked in Newcastle into the thing. And they lost that referendum, 168,000 votes to 198,000 votes. Now, if they had just set the water at latitude 32 degrees south, just south of Taree, they would have won that nearly 70% of the vote for. And if that had happened, I would suspect we would probably have several other states by now, but that wasn't to be.
But but Bill, it's the only way, truthfully, that the regional health outcomes, especially, and education outcomes, this idea of having, I'm in Brisbane, and this idea of having a state further away from Cairns, or almost the same distance as Brisbane is from Melbourne. This area cannot make or determine, have any self-determination. And that need for local solutions and that need to drive competitive federalism has arrived. And it's not me saying, it's the numbers saying it. I mean, how on earth, like when, the politicians, Crucifulli and Miles, have been going up and down the coast. I mean, how does regional Queensland, North Queensland, especially, with a collective population that's bigger than Tasmania, rivals anything past Bundaberg, rivals South Australia, even WA. How on earth can you continue to govern that number of people over that number of distance from Brisbane? It's absurd.
Well, the absurd thing is the people in central and North Queensland, the million of them that reside there, and their so-called leadership can't get their act together and sort of say, well, we want it, and sort of back the people who are advocating for it. But like I say, a central and North Queensland state, of northern Queensland would have 1 million people. It's basically all the area under the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund in Queensland. I mean, the revenue base that it has, it's more than economically viable. And the other thing is, like you say, I don't understand why people can't get it through their head that it's a better idea for you to make the decisions for yourself in your region than let someone down in Brisbane come up with something. And especially when the people who are making the decision in Brisbane, in regards to the environment and farming and fishing and that in our area, are basically people who have been into the bureaucracy from the WWF or the Marine Conservation Society or the Wildlife Conservation Society and filled out the bureaucracy down there. And they're the ones who don't kid me that the politicians are coming up with this legislation. This is stuff that's been formulated by bureaucrats in there over time and manipulate things, and they just give it to their political people. Now, put that through your parliament, please. So, yeah.
But look, I mean, but irrespective of the background of if they come from WWF we should clarify that that's the World Wildlife Fund, not the former wrestling company. But irrespective of political view, one would have to argue is the time for this federation in its current guise with the population flows, is it economically the best way forward? And that's a debate which all Australians shouldn't be afraid to have. I mean, for example, like, do the people, like, if I was Mildura, benefit from having their capital in Victoria, Griffin, I say Griffith, sorry. The reason I say that is because the reality is the distances traveled, the need for critical care, an aging population, but a growing population. I mean, we still rely heavily on migration. This need for, like, we've spoken about a lot of challenges in this call, but the thing is, we do need debate. I mean, I wasn't surprised the Voice didn't get up at the most recent referendum, but also have argued since, in newspaper columns, that we should be having more referendums. We should be asking these questions. We should be asking these questions not just our political leadership, but also the business leadership. We need to be having these debates because the thing is, you have to ask, is this the best for Australia? And currently, Federation as it works at the moment. Now, I also said that Robbie Katter's, if I was to be a fly on the wall, that if he does become a kingmaker, and given the tightness of the polls we've seen the last week, that could certainly happen. That should be the number one bargaining chip, I would submit, because that's the one, for example, where you could really truly drag the North into the conversation.
It certainly need to be had. But if we just go back to your story in the article, and we'll lead on to another conversation about what's going on in the regions. Building for building sake, for infrastructure. We get a lot of infrastructure, but it's not sort of infrastructure that actually generates money. If you look at spending in the Cross River Rail, that project sort of was touted to be $5 billion, and it's probably going to blow out to somewhere towards 10 in that. But that will never generate a dollar of wealth for the state. It's, to my way of thinking, it's going to be a liability over time because tunnels aren't cheap to maintain. And then if you're depending on user pays, at least some good proportion, well, we're getting nowhere with that. Plus, if we've got 50-cent fares, we're never going to get any return on a $5 billion investment for a Cross River Rail.
No, I think that was so. I think there was Infrastructure Australia. It's been a while since I've read that piece, but Infrastructure Australia in 2017 said that the benefits of the Cross River Rail were overstated. They didn't say grossly overstated, they just said were overstated. Now, the project has had merit, but again, the city of Brisbane, is now 2.5 million, I think, probably approaching 3 as the crow flies in terms of how you cut it. It's geographically massive, hard to get around, and now urban sprawl everywhere. It's the cost of congestion, the cost of, trying to build these places and these existing places, I might add, by, having, like townhouses 40 kilometers from the CBD. I mean, they beg questions as to, is this the best way to do town planning? And again, that comes back to this thing of, we're not asking the questions anymore as a country. We seem to be kind of, oh, it's all too hard. Now, if we were to talk about solving housing crises, why do people, if they want to, they can go and live in the country somewhere, they could probably live on welfare if they could find a dwelling suitable enough. That could be a conventional line of thinking. It's probably not. I think it's probably quite difficult to promote that because of, then the problems are not enough infrastructure. The costs of fuel are incredibly high. The housing's not as cheap as you may have thought. And the welfare doesn't cover anything. So why do people with the housing crisis still choose to cluster around these regions? That's because they've got everything. They've got the hospitals and you name it. We're not making
amenity.
That's right. We're not asking the critical questions as to why can't we occupy more of this land mass and do it responsibly? Why is that question not being asked? And sadly, I think, the realm of dangerous ideas, for want of a description, or bold economic thinking, it's a great throwaway line at the political level, but it's never going to be countenanced because it's always going to be the domain of cranks and crazies who dare to think differently. But unfortunately, in Australia, that need to think differently is arriving a lot sooner than many think. I mean, the idea that of third-term state government and the Labor Party, which has overseen some truly terrible crime outcomes, is competitive going to a fourth term, that speaks volumes as to how poor the debate has become. I mean, but again, it's also a pox in the opposition that hasn't been able to land a glove in them as well. So,
but the other thing is too is how more livable would Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne be if 1 million people moved out from there into the regions and took up positions there, and left.
But you need the industry of
take the
government.
pressure off, But we've got the space to build the infrastructure in these regions fairly freely without constraints of existing problems.
But Bill, you need the industry of government. Like, so for example, the state, for example, can employ a Treasury department. North Queensland doesn't have a Treasury department, or they might have a few people with Treasury working up there, but nowhere near the quantum of a region, let's say, that. And it does, like, people talk about what does it mean, bigger regional councils or what? I mean, you call it states or bigger regional councils. Federation has to devolve where you've actually got the industry of government, that is people employed in the administration function of government. They need to be like close to the decision making that affects the people that live there. That's the principle which we're not talking about. And that's really what we should be having discussion around federation. Does it work in its current form with its, 5 or 6 states and 2 territories? The answer is no. It's clearly starting to creak. That's the conversation that has to be had.
Well, that's right. But I mean, we've got Chapter 6 that provides us with the provisions to do it. We just got to get active to do it. And I think if we do get one state across the line, it wouldn't be long before another 3 states would happen fairly in quick succession.
So what's the polling up in North Queensland? What's the sentiment for a 7th state?
It varies from area to area, because the biggest problem is because no one out there is leading it. Like even Catters, that they talk about it, but they don't lead the conversation. you still got a lot of this mindset with people that it can't be done, and you got ridiculous situation with, IPA came up to Cairns and did a bit of a tour a few weeks ago, and they touched on things like Northern Queensland State, but the people knew nothing about how it works or that. They still have got this mindset, that it's a vote of the whole of Australia on the issue. The bloody only people who vote for in a referendum for a new state is the people in the area that's trying to secede. And I mean that's already a precedent under what happened in New South Wales. But when you've got people who are supposed to be learned, haven't got a clue of the basics, it makes it a bloody hard job.
Okay, well, I've turned the interviewer now. I'll put it to you this. So if that's the case, all right, so I'll put it another way. I've seen polling, right? And that if they were, let's say the demarcation line is, I don't know, Mackay to the top there of, Carpentaria, that is the prevailing wisdom would suggest that vote would get up, that people would happily go to form their own state. Like, I don't think I'm far off the base there, but the bottom line is that you could probably even go North Queensland and far north. It does. The point being is, I don't think this issue is going away, and I think that I'd say to you though, we can do regional RAP and all that, but within these programs, when you're outside the capital, that's always going to be there's always going to be a gripe, the fact that you just miss out the whole time. So if you're missing out the whole time, the question I've got for you is, how long eventually something breaks?
The thing that will break, and I mean, there's always been this conversation about our fair share. That's got nothing to do with it. It's simply about having political influence and making your own decisions, sort of thing. We've got a situation where they had the last redistribution in 2017. We were going to lose 2 regional seats in North and Central Queensland. The Katters got that changed to an increase in the parliament. So you got 4 new seats down in southeast Queensland, and we kept our 18 seats. But we're going to another redistribution before the 28 election, and 560,000 more voters will have come onto the roll across the state in different areas. So you've got places like Coomera. It's got 54,000 voters in it. Now, the state average is only around about 38,000 if you divide the voting population by 93. And Logan's got about 45,000. So there's got to be some filling of additional seats in southeast Queensland come the next redistribution. And that will cause at least 2 regional seats to go, and they will be will go for sure. And the other one will be either Marani or Hinchinbrook, because they're fairly long and thin, and they can be divided up to different other electorates to fill those gaps. So maybe that's an awakening in regards to people. They've got to get to the understanding, if they don't do something, they're just going to become like, if you look at New South Wales, that's got 8.5 million people in it. Now, west of the divide, there's only 8 state seats in Western. And that's what's going to happen to North and Central Queensland by the time we get to 8.5 million. People have just got to wake up and say, well, we've got to look after this as representation. The other thing that's killing us is the Senate. The crossbench in the Senate is the biggest pain in the neck to Australia and to regional Australia. That's where some of the worst legislation is being crafted and manipulated to harm us. With 3 new states, the whole situation in the Senate changes, and that's the biggest key to the change in the federation. You have another three states. Now, instead of having 12 senators, you only have 8 senators per state. So of the 6 current states, they're going to go down to about 48 senators. The 3 regional states, they're going to have 24. They're going to make a major difference in what is coming out of that Senate. and especially what it's going to do is cull down the crossbench. But that's the sort
Well,
of
I
focus we're
mean,
looking at.
so the Senate's been the upper house in Australia has long, ever been since Don Chip worked out that you could do something. You know, I mean, but yeah, so bad is like, I mean, when they had like the auto enthusiast guy, I think it was Ricky,
Ricky Muir.
yeah, Ricky Muir, and I mean, um, but that was kind of the preference whisperer and all sorts of things. But the bottom line is that the big economic debate, and clearly there is a dividing line. I'm not sure if it's a Newcastle line or even a Byron Bay line or a Brisbane line, but there is clearly a massive disconnect to the productive part of the Australian economy, and let's say probably those more wedded to services and those types of things. So being the North has probably in some parts, it is actually affected, more heavily by some of the decision making in Canberra, especially around agriculture, environment policy, and whether it's actually the best place, because it actually has the impact on those that produce, and so and whether so that remains to be a very interesting topic. But my point writing about it was it shouldn't be a debate or a discussion that people should shy away from. Our problems are really, I think, in Australia, they're twofold. We've got a capability gap clearly in our workforce, and clearly the types of jobs we're creating and in the types of businesses we are creating, they seem more wedded to government action than actual true entrepreneurship. And that's a problem if you're going to compete in the Asian century, which again has its own problems, and mainly a demographic time bomb, which is now starting to go off in China. So and it's certainly gone off in Japan, which is, they've got this aging population, and everyone, saying, oh, it's all going ahead in China. Well, they've got 90 million square meters of units which no one lives in. So, you know what I mean? Like there's none of these questions are linear, you know what I mean? So we have to be able to discuss them. We have to kind of work out where the place in the world is. But if we're not producing product which is capable of going to an export market, you've got problems.
Well, that's right. And the thing is, but we've got to get to the stage of adding value ourselves somewhere along the line, and that doesn't seem to be a priority.
Well,
But just,
technology is what does it. That's where you build your capability. And like we don't. You can learn code and all that, but you need to be able to pair that too with working in business and in industry. You have to kind of develop the culture needs to change. I mean, it has happened in Ireland. They took a rather pretty anemic economy, and they went down the path of heavy education, and the Irish have got not a bad technology sector now. Had a few hiccups along the way, but by and large, Ireland's story is pretty good. So it can happen.
I think the other thing is too, with the conversation, we welcome more discussion on separate states. So I think it's, like you say, it's something we have to have. But the thing is, people need to get on the same page, because one of the things you've got to learn and be aware of that, well, for those people who want a separate state, there's plenty of out there who want to keep it the same. They don't want change. I mean, the people in Brisbane, depending on the revenue or having the power, they don't want things to change. So you've got the situation, unless you can define what you want and prove, and it's self-evident that it's a viable state, you're going to have people like you did in the New South Wales situation, where the New England New State movement had run out of money. It expended nearly £1 million over a decade. When it got to the referendum, it couldn't mount a yes or no case because it wasn't funded as well by the government. The government didn't even fund a yes or no case or whatever.
Oh.
And the Labor Party ran a hard campaign against it. Now, with a separate state for North Queensland, the first thing that happens, the Labor interests will come out and poo-poo it, and they'll drag out people like Paul Williams, and he'll stick it to us straight away. Oh, you get more money per capita and all this sort of thing, and you're really well.
So just for the benefit, so Paul Williams is a university lecturer in political science at the Griffith University.
But they wheel him out every time, sort of thing. But the thing is, if you want to, you want to stand up and argue with him in regards to, uh, there's plenty of information that debunks that, but no one's prepared to listen, to a difficultly explained sort of thing. It's just got to be self-evident. So we're all for it. There's already a line built for us by the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund that defines Northern Australia. Therefore, it defines Northern Queensland, and even that's recognised by the Queensland Treasury. So that gives us 49 LGAs. It gives us the wealth of Central and North Queensland all put together. It gives us 1 million residents. So it's pretty self-evident we're a viable state. So that argument goes there. The other thing, all we've got to do is convince people, hey, it's good for you to do it. But I also think we can show that it will be good for the nation in regards to it starts off the conversation again with competitive federalism. So we welcome the discussion. We just hope more people throw it out there so we get the opportunity to put our case across. But before we've just gone over the hour, but I just want to touch on one last thing. We haven't got even through half of that story, but I'll just go back to it.
I can talk, Bill. I can talk.
But this is also in the story, and I mean, we had reference to the machinations of Sir Leo Helchester and his input to making Queensland great, basically. But when we were entering into the last state election, there was a bit of discussion on a revamped sort of Bradfield scheme. And I think Deborah Freckington was running with it, and it got a bit of conversation going. And what it got out of the Labor Party was, they'll have a review. So it's sort of that issue was sort of at the forefront.
But since then, of course, we've had major flooding in the state of Queensland. So every time we get big flooding, water infrastructure ceases to be an issue because, what do you do with it? But there is a need to get those flows right. There's a need to look at the engineering solutions. That's where the advantage is. You get the state blessed with black soil everywhere.
Well, you just got to add water. But the thing is, the biggest problem I saw with the Bradfield scheme, it didn't look far enough north. I mean, we got the Flinders River, and we've got the Mitchell, that dwarfs a lot of the other rivers down south. So we don't have to send them water down south. We just have to use it ourselves. But we've got constraints in regards to the way they set the criteria for water projects, like building a dam. Like it has to earn back the capital cost in 30 years. Well, a dam survives for 100 odd years at least.
Yeah, they do.
As long as it's built right.
And they also, but the dams are also, they change the landscape as well. Like the flows, the sediment, everything like that. Like, I mean, they actually are kind of earth shifting in their in their final design and how they go about their life. They can change, but the truth of the matter is that they are an investment. But again, it's again one of these things where at the time of that Bradfield, that was Sir Leo Hilscher and I think it was Sir Frank Moore. They were the architects behind it. I think Queensland, the review said it wasn't viable, but Peter Beattie, they've all talked about variations of this, regardless of, there is an understanding, particularly from the Department of Natural Resources, that there does need to be an engineering solution, not sure of the quantum, but you do have to be able to start cashing in your advantages. I mean, that part of the state has enormous rainfall, has the perfect growing conditions for another key crops. And food security is not going away as an issue, and so that's going to be, again, that's another advantage. Which, Australia is blessed with all this natural resource, but like we don't have the people, we don't have the pioneering spirit to necessarily. That's not out of people's desire to want to live elsewhere. And that's just kind of the byproduct of the way we've set up. And, like that comes back to the conversation tonight. We're set up really geared towards being worker bees clustered around major population centres. And as pretty as Sydney is, it doesn't raise a cracker in terms of, really developing anything more meaningful than, a hipster
Shifting money around.
shifting money around, a hipster drinking the latest coffee. That's the truth.
Do you think the only chance of Australia becoming refocused is we have to go to that plunge, that depths of making such big mistakes and errors that we're sort of, the lights have gone out because we've spent money on renewables. We can't make a buck, our dollar's down to $30 US to turn things around? Or do you think somewhere along the line, no, there are people out there to rescue the situation?
Well, I think, like we're talking in thematics, right? So we're talking kind of broad stuff. There are for every negative story, there's always underneath, you peel back the layers, there's always people who are working very hard and then creating opportunity. 2 points to it. Reform often is forced upon nations and regions and states by the fact that something no longer works. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is there's no real wake-up moment. I don't think that we've ever seen in history. I think most of, for example, I mentioned Greece before, the wheel carries on. These places which do experience recessions tend to bounce back very quickly. They also tend to, in Italy, for example, they tend to make the same mistakes. So they did actually have an autocrat. I think Mario Monti was his name, about 12 years ago, and he was a PM installed, but he was a pure economist to turn the Italian situation around. And that was but I think a lot of those good things that he installed has since been unwound. No, you don't need what tends to happen is, Western Australia's good fortune, for one of better things, because it was in iron ore, for example, its incredible wealth drive over the last 25 years has come from the fact that they've been a reliable supplier of iron ore, tapped into the greatest growth story over 2 business cycles and what's happened in mainland China. And they've produced a product consistently, reliably, and above an elevated price. And so those things are wonderful headlines, but they also mask the need to actually
a lot of faults underneath.
And so, in Queensland, we're seeing, the slow, the tough deal of dealing mining in this state because, you've had a royalty regime, which, despite what the Treasurer says, and he is not a fan of mining, he makes that quite clear. But the problem, this state has got to introduce a stealth tax on its resources sector. There's no major new projects coming online. And if there's no major new project coming along, it becomes a 10-year problem. In 10 years, when, we've got the Olympics, which, aren't that popular, when they finally arrive, beyond the sugar hit of tourism inbound visitor numbers, you've got a major budgetary problem because the time you needed to build those resources capable of fueling the revenue engine, the projects have been stalled based on a rather unfavourable regulatory environment.
Well, I think the interesting thing there is in the 22-23 year, coal royalties mainly, of course, was $18 billion into the coffers. This last financial year, it's dropped down to $12 billion. It will continue to drop because those prices are eased. But like you say, what it's done, and we've been, it's sort of beggars belief that we have leaders who ignore our most respected trading partner when the Japanese ambassador comes at you and says, you're endangering investment in your country. For making these changes without consultation, and I think that's been proved in regards to the money that's coming into investment. And you would know from being in mining.com.au, looking at all that stuff, you'd have a pretty good overview of the inflow of investment into mine. Well, the thing is, that regime doesn't just affect coal; it could affect other industries.
So Queensland's trying to develop critical minerals. There also, there's some mines that do magnetite. there's a greater focus now on copper. Like the state's a big state. People forget that. Yeah, there's a lot of focus how big Western Australia. Queensland is a massive state. Make no
1.6 million kilometres, square kilometres.
it's absolutely gigantic, and so there's that. There's obviously the thing which is starting to get, their problems, and they need to be fixed. I think I'm seeing some furious wind-ups too in our conversation.
Okay, then, no worries. Thanks for, we'll sort of leave it there, but we've only sort of just touched on, maybe we'll come back sometime after the election and have a bit of a wind up over that. But I'd really like to thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate you coming on and being a supporter of, more states in the Federation. I appreciate that. But if you could just stay on the line for a sec, I'll just wind up and introduce next week's guest. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, I'll have Zara Lewin on from the National Irrigators Council, and we'll be discussing the new framework for the water infrastructure across Australia and the more restrictions coming into play for our water users. And this is Australia-wide, not just down in the Murray-Darling Basin or something like that. It's coming to a dam near you. So please join us again next week. Thank you.